Good day. Today is Monday, 3rd February 2025, and the big story across the global media today in the United States, in Europe, in China, in Russia is not the conflict in Ukraine or the conflict in the Middle East. It is the tariffs that President Trump basically announced over the course of the weekend, and which have come into effect today, and which slap tariffs on imported goods from Canada and Mexico at the rate of 25%, and also tariffs, 10% tariffs on imported goods from China. And this has come as a major shock. I think it's probably fair to say that a week ago, there were still discussions and expectations in much of the world that a lot of the talk that was coming from the Trump administration about tariffs was just talk, that this was the president talking about things like this, but that he didn't really intend it, and that his officials didn't really intend it. And, well, I get the sense that the slapping of the tariffs, the scale of the tariffs, the fact that Mexico and Canada have been picked on, these are the two countries which way back in the early 1980s, during the period of the Reagan administration, were persuaded to agree a free trade zone with the United States. The total reversal of this whole policy has come as a shock to both the Canadian and the Mexican governments, and to many other governments around the world. Now, I've been looking at the Chinese media. There, for the moment, they're taking the imposition of the 10% tariffs on Chinese goods exported to the United States in their stride. I think the Chinese have been working hard for at least 10 years to start diversifying their export focus away from the United States to other places. And I think anyway that China for some time, without of course publicly saying as much, has gradually been working towards a more Eurasian approach to its economic policies, developing trading links with Russia, the Central Asian states, ultimately perhaps Iran and Turkey, and also the ASEAN states of the Pacific. And that for some time now, the Chinese have been quietly moving towards making trade with these countries, and perhaps ultimately with India as well, the main focus of their international trade. They've seen that the writing is on the wall for the enormously close economic relations that are developed with the United States starting in the 1980s. They understand that the American policy with this respect is shifting. But Mexico and Canada are in a completely different position. I said that both of these countries had entered into, in effect, a free trade association with the United States way back in the early 1980s, that the effect of that has been to reshape their domestic economies. So in Canada, we've had a process of deindustrialization take shape since the early 1980s, with Canada focusing increasingly on trading in those goods and commodities that would succeed in the gigantic American market. As I said, changing to a great extent the orientation of the Canadian economy. And conversely, in Mexico, we've seen a process of industrialization as American producers have established factories in Mexico which have been shipping goods to the United States. So all of that now is at risk. The governments of these two countries have been caught on the hop. These enormous changes in trading systems are going to present massive challenges to both of these countries. There is a belief that Canada, with a more established, more diversified economy, might be able to adapt more quickly and more successfully to these changes that the United States is implementing. But of course, in Mexico, it might be different. There, the crisis might deepen, and of course, complicating the relationship between Mexico and the United States. There is the border issue and the issue of the cartels, and there's been all kinds of warnings from the United States, from the new administration, that the administration is prepared to take, shall we say, kinetic action, conceivably against Mexico itself, or at least within Mexico, in order to address these problems. Anybody familiar with the history of Mexico and the United States, extending back to the mid-19th century, will know what a politically volatile prospect this sort of potential conflict between Mexico and the United States might be. Anyway, we'll see how things shape out. This is obviously big, dramatic news. And it's big and dramatic news for the Europeans as well, because, of course, the EU has also been trading with the United States. It's been running trade surpluses with the United States for some time. German industry, the German car industry, major exporter to the United States. And everyone knows that big tariffs targeting European exporters are coming from the United States as well. And again, one gets the sense of a political class in Europe that is in total denial about this. They've done absolutely nothing to prepare for these moves. They're already facing major difficulties because of the energy crisis that they have inflicted on themselves as a result of their decision to cut themselves off from cheap pipeline gas and, by the way, also oil from Russia. And, well, they now face tariffs on their exporters, and they could also, and this is something not to be discounted, they could also be facing restrictions imposed by the United States, restricting high technology exports from the United States to Europe and investment in technology projects in Europe by American companies. That might have a significant impact. To give just one example, the famous lithography machines that are made in the Netherlands and which the Netherlands has exported all around the world, but most famously in the case of the ultra-advanced lithography machines, the ones that make the super fast and super small chips, super advanced chips. Well, those lithography machines were created on the basis of US patents. It was all done as a result of agreements entered into between the Dutch and American governments, between Dutch and US businesses. And it was done because in the Netherlands, in Europe at that time, there were particular subcomponent manufacturers that the Dutch could call on to make the lithography machines more quickly and more effectively and cheaply than would have been the case in the United States at that time. And of course, the Netherlands, which has, by the way, an advanced machine building and advanced laboratory industries, laboratory tools industries, precision equipment and that kind of thing. Well, the Netherlands benefited from this arrangement because they became, in effect, the monopoly producers and suppliers of these very advanced lithography machines. And, well, it could be that this huge shift in American economic orientation will make projects like that impossible from this time, that the days when the Americans did the research, did the science, and then arranged for the Europeans to produce the goods, that might not come back again. We might come back instead to the world that existed before the 1960s, when the Americans tried to hoard these technologies to themselves. Just saying. So the Europeans facing very, very severe problems. Now, there is a discussion underway in the media and, by the way, the financial community in Europe, in the United States, which says that this new tariff campaign that the Trump administration is engaging in can't last, that it's going to create severe supply problems in the United States, that it is going to lead to a major uptick in domestic inflation in the United States, that the political consequences of all of this for the Trump administration are going to be severe, and that eventually, perhaps fairly soon, the administration, the president, are going to have to change course, and they're going to have to modify and dilute their tariff policies, and perhaps even in the end abandon them completely. And again, if you read the media, amid all the complaints, the criticisms, especially in Europe, about how disruptive and chaotic these tariff plans actually are, one can't avoid the subtext that this is not in the end for real, that this is Donald Trump living in the 1890s, in the time of William McKinley, not really having thought this through, not really understanding the economics behind his decisions very well, and that it is only a question of time before he is brought to heel and before the administration changes course. Well, that may be so, and I make absolutely no predictions here. I don't know the economics of this as well as some people pretend to do. I'm going to say, by the way, that I'm not convinced that many of these people who write these articles and these commentaries in the media, making all kinds of definite predictions about where all this is going to go and how it's going to end up, I'm not sure that they know as much about this as they think they do. And it could be that their expectations, their predictions, will not turn out right in the end. I'm going to just throw up an example from history, and I want to stress I'm not drawing any direct comparisons. I'm not saying that because this happened in historical time, the same is going to happen now in the United States. But in my previous program, I discussed how in the early 20th century, there was a shift in British economic policy and in British imperial policy. There was attempts associated with the personality of the now largely forgotten British politician, Joseph Chamberlain, to revisit the approach that Britain was taking in terms of its global policies, and that I said that some of this reminded me of some of the changes that the Trump administration is trying to execute in the United States today. Now, Joseph Chamberlain came from Birmingham, a major industrial centre in Britain. In fact, for a time he was mayor of that city. And he was widely acknowledged to be a spokesman for major industrial interests. And in the early 20th century, he became a major advocate of the abandonment of the previous British economic policy of free trade, whereby Britain freely imported goods from around the world. Instead, Chamberlain became an advocate of protection of tariffs in order to protect domestic industries. And he faced much of the same criticism of his tariff proposals as we're hearing today. People said that it wouldn't work, that he didn't understand the complex supply process. They said that imposing tariffs in the way that Chamberlain was suggesting would lead to higher inflation. And in fact, in 1906, going deep into the history now, there was a general election in Britain which revolved specifically around Joseph Chamberlain's tariff proposals. And Joseph Chamberlain's party, the Conservatives, were massively defeated. They suffered a landslide defeat, largely because the British electorate assumed that Chamberlain's tariff proposal would lead to higher inflation in Britain, with an awful lot being said at the time about the price of bread specifically. It didn't all end in 1906. Debate about economic policy continued in Britain thereafter, and in the early 1930s, policy changed, and essentially Joseph Chamberlain's program was adopted, even though by this time he was himself dead. And the British took sterling off the gold standard. They defaulted on their wartime loans to the United States, their First World War loans to the United States, a fact that they don't talk about very much today, by the way. And of course, they imposed tariffs. And contrary to the claims that had been made previously, the tariffs did not result in higher inflation. In fact, what they did lead to was an industrial revival in Britain that actually did take place in the 1930s and continued through the 1940s, through the period of the Second World War, and on into the 1950s. Now, again, I want to stress, simply because tariffs in Britain from the 1930s for a certain period of time appeared to achieve that which their advocates had said they would. That doesn't mean that the same will prove today with the United States. But I don't think that on these issues, some of these very dogmatic comments that are being made about tariffs, about tariff policy, really are very helpful. And I, anyway, will wait and see what the result of all of these changes is going to be. I think perhaps it's worth pointing out that economic policy in the United States has been on an unsustainable trajectory for some time. Debt is rising. State to GDP debt is now significantly above 100% of GDP. There's been mounting problems in the financial system. One gets the sense that the US government has essentially lost control of the budget, and there have been some clear signs of deindustrialization in the United States underway for some period of time. So, in the absence of any real plan to change things, alternative plan to the one that Trump and his team are coming up with, well, since nobody is offering any other alternative, perhaps it's not surprising that tariffs are being attempted now. And I think that those people in Europe, in China maybe, in Canada, who think that this is all a brief thing, that it will all eventually be reversed, I think that they might find that this is actually a fundamental change, and one which the United States will continue to follow through on. Anyway, there it is. We have tariff policies in the United States, and I'm going to just finish my comments here by saying that it really is richly ironic for me that all of those people who for the last 10 plus years have been cheering on in Europe every iteration of the the sanctions policies that the United States has been following, whether with respect to China or most especially with respect to Russia. They've been very, very keen on tariffs on the Russians. They continue to advocate more and more sanctions on the Russians. They want more sanctions on the Russian oil and energy industries and that sort of thing. Anyway, now they are faced by economic action by the United States, which will be at least as important in affecting the shape of the US of the world economy, and indeed in terms of Europe, the European economy, as the various sanctions that the United States has been imposing on countries like Russia. Now, the Russians, as I've discussed in many programs, have adapted to the sanctions very well. Whether the Europeans will adapt to the tariffs that the Americans look likely to impose on them, well, that is another matter. Since I brought up Russia and Russian economic policies and economic circumstances, I thought I would just mention briefly and in passing the latest actual news about the real state of the Russian economy. We've not had full figures for the state of the performance of the Russian economy in January of this year. We're only a few days from the end of January, so it's too early to be able to say. But we have had this news. This is from S&P Global. They're saying that the Russian manufacturing PMI rose in January to 53.1 points from 50.8 points a month earlier, according to a survey of manufacturers, Russian manufacturers, carried out by S&P Global. The latest improvement in the state of the goods manufacturing sector was the fourth in recent months and significant overall. Moreover, the growth rate was the fastest since July 2024 and above average. According to S&P Global, the significant growth of the Russian manufacturing PMI index in January was due to an improved demand and further increase in the number of new orders. An index value above 50 points indicates an increase in business activity and a slowdown below this level. So, this has come as something of a surprise. By the way, a surprise to me. I thought that all of the big increases in interest rates that we've seen in Russia from the summer would lead to a slowdown in manufacturing and generally economic activity. Well, the PMI surveys are telling a different story. The very different structure of the Russian economy, the fact that debt levels in Russia altogether are much lower than they are in the West, the fact that big manufacturers are able to obtain loans at preferential rates, all of that points to continued expansion, has made possible what looks like continued expansion. And it looks like the Russian economy has begun 2025 on a strong footing, a much stronger footing than anyone expected. Just saying. So anyway, let's wait and see what the new Trump tariffs do, how Mexico and Canada are going to respond, what China is going to do, what, if anything, the Europeans are going to do, and well, we'll see how it all turns out. Whether they will prove, all of these economies will prove as resilient in the face of American tariffs as the Russians have proved in the face of American and European sanctions. Just saying. In one respect, economic pressure from the United States does seem to be having an effect. There was a kind of climb down from Colombia a few days ago when the Colombian government appeared to reverse course on receiving flights from the United States repatriating migrants. I ought to say that I'm not sure that this has been quite as sharp a reversal as some reports claim. I understand that the Colombian authorities had objected not to return flights from the United States with migrants, but to military flights by the United States to Colombia returning migrants. And I understand that at least some of the flights that have taken place over the last couple of days have been civilian flights using civilian aircraft, so that there does seem to have been a shift of policy in the United States also. But I'm not going to pretend that I am fully up to speed with this story, and I might be wrong about this. But anyway, the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has also been to Panama. He's talked about the Panama Canal with the Panamanian government and the Panamanian authorities, who are very, very keen to retain control of the canal, have apparently bent under some of this American pressure. They've cancelled some sort of servicing agreement that they had reached to service the canal with a company from China, or so I understand. And Panama has apparently also given undertakings that it will withdraw from China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, my own view is that the Chinese some time ago came to the decision that the Belt and Road Initiative was not going to be a success in places too close to America's sphere of influence, and that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is anyway becoming increasingly integrated within the overall BRICS project, is being refocused more on Eurasia and developing the global trading and financial system that is centered on the BRICS. So in other words, the BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, which about a decade ago appeared to be the centerpiece of Chinese trade policy has been quietly downgraded as China focuses instead more on the BRICS. But nonetheless, and having said all of that, I can't imagine that the Chinese are going to be pleased with what has just happened in Panama, and of course they're also absorbing the tariffs that the administration has just imposed on them, and probably they're preparing for further tariffs still to come. And one way or the other, I think the Chinese are probably also now busy working out their own response to all of these moves that the United States is taking. Now, just to quickly add on the geopolitics of this, with China coming under renewed economic pressure from the United States on trade issues, I would have thought that the Chinese are going to value their other trade partnerships even more. The trade partnership with Russia is burgeoning, so I cannot imagine that the Chinese are going to be responsive to American requests for China to increase pressure on Russia, to force Russia to compromise over the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to make a suggestion. I think that over the next couple of weeks, we are going to see a major effort by China and India, now that there's been some relaxation of the tensions on their common border, and after the meeting that Modi and Xi Jinping had together at the Kazan meeting of the BRICS states, I'm going to make a guess that over the next few weeks, again, partly in response to all of this economic pressure from the United States, the Chinese and the Indians are going to start working more closely with each other to try to develop their trade links and to reorient their trade more closely with each other. Anyway, we will see where all of this goes. This is a major shift in global economics and, of course, in American economic policy. As I discussed in my program yesterday, it is part of that further huge shift that is going on in the United States, involving personnel policy, foreign policy, all of these things that are playing out, and whose full implications and ultimate success we simply cannot yet judge. Let's return, however, to the perennial topic of these programs, the conflict in Ukraine, which to a degree that, again, cannot be overstated, has been the catalyst of all of these changes. As I said in my program yesterday, at least as important in bringing about these shifts in American policy as the economic rise of China has been the return of Russia as a great power and its demonstration of its power in the conflict in Ukraine. So what is happening at the moment with respect to Ukraine? Well, apparently there's going to be a meeting in a short time of EU leaders. Apparently the British are going to be invited as well, and the Ukrainians will also attend. And the meeting is apparently going to discuss the steps that the Europeans will take to prepare for a possible defense of Europe from Russia, but also, most interestingly, to discuss how Europe should respond to these changes that are taking place in the United States. And all of this appears to be quite separate from the proposal that the French foreign minister made to Marco Rubio during their telephone call of a few days ago, in which the French apparently invited the Americans to attend a meeting with the Europeans in Europe, at which the Ukrainians would also be present, which was supposedly also intended to discuss the conflict in Ukraine. So the Europeans still talking with each other, but very uncertain from what I can see as to what they're going to do. The European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is not giving any kind of lead at the moment, and it's very difficult to see how she can give a lead. After all, she has been fervidly committed to the alliance with the United States and has unswervingly followed the lead of the Biden administration over the last 4 years. So this abrupt shift in policy that is happening with the arrival of Donald Trump, policy on tariffs, but also policy with respect to Ukraine, must be both alarming and baffling to her and to the Commission as a whole. And one gets the sense of European leaders operating in a vacuum, very uncertain what to do, unclear where America is going. Some of them are pushing back. The NATO Secretary General and former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has made a really bizarre public statement. He's spoken about how the front lines in Ukraine are moving in the wrong direction, which is a strange way of admitting that the Russians are advancing. But anyway, Mark Rutte can't quite bring himself to say that, so he talks instead about the front lines moving in the wrong direction. He talks about how it's important to try to get them to start moving in the right direction again. Well, good luck with that. I don't think anybody seriously believes that that can happen. Anyway, Mark Rutte still clinging to the fantasies of some kind of victory over the Russians in Ukraine, still talking in that way, still repeating the discredited and exhausted mantras of the Biden era, and apparently unable to think or come up with anything different. All very unsurprising when you know Mark Rutte's background, but there it is. So European leaders still uncertain, in denial. We saw that also with Prime Minister Starmer of Britain. He went, as we know, to Ukraine a short while ago, signed the 100-year agreement. Zelensky has very unhelpfully, I think the British will probably be seething about this. Anyway, Zelensky has disclosed that there are all kinds of secret protocols to this agreement as well, all kinds of secret clauses. He hasn't told us what those clauses are about, but apparently reasonable guess is that they involve joint military and intelligence cooperation between Britain and Ukraine, and maybe they also may include provisions for the establishment of bases, British bases in Ukraine. Who can say? But anyway, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, all completely in denial about what is going on in Ukraine itself, completely in denial about the increasingly obvious shifts in American policy, and Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, living on his own planet as well, and no real sign that the Europeans are in any position to rethink or shape their policy. And, well, part of this general disorientation in Europe is reflected in the political crises that are now playing out, respectively, in France and Germany. In France, President Macron's latest pick for Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou, has announced that he's going to oppose his budget by decree. His budget is identical to the previously rejected budget proposed by Monsieur Bayrou's predecessor, Michel Barnier, who then lost a confidence vote in the French Parliament and had to step down. I understand that Jean-Luc Mélenchon's group in the French Parliament is again proposing a no confidence vote in Monsieur Bayrou. Since Monsieur Bayrou has given up any hope of getting his budget through the French Parliament, it suggests to me that he no longer has support in the Parliament, which makes me think that the no confidence vote in him will pass. He presumably will then have to step down. It's completely unclear what President Macron intends to do, but with this kind of crisis underway in France, with France looking increasingly ungovernable, it's difficult to see that the French are in any position at the moment to come up with any constructive plan to address the pressures from Donald Trump or to really address the ongoing situation in Ukraine. Certainly, deployment of French troops to Ukraine at this time, in this particular political atmosphere, with Macron's support having evaporated, apparently his polling rating is at catastrophically low levels, has fallen lower than it has ever been at any point in his presidency, and with the French Parliament strongly opposed to military deployments by France in Ukraine. Certainly at this time, that idea of Macron's hardly looks politically achievable, given the state of France. And of course, in Germany, we are in the middle of an election campaign. Friedrich Merz's political parliamentary manoeuvres of last week seem to have undermined support for him. He's now had the embarrassment of having 12 deputies of his own party, the CDU, vote against him on a proposed law to restrict immigration. It looks as if there's a major split in the political class developing in Germany, and the election apparently is undecided, with all of the reports suggesting that the AfD is continuing to gain ground. So again, it's not obvious how the Europeans, with France and also Germany, unable to come together and put together a plan, are going to shape any longer the situation in Ukraine. On the issue of the Europeans, by the way, President Putin has now made further comments to his journalist friend, Pavel Zarubin. He says that the European leaders of today, men and women of no special consequence, that unlike European leaders of the past, they are utterly subject to American control, that given the force of Donald Trump's personality, he will have no difficulty bringing them to heel, and that whatever protests and complaints there are from Europe, whatever statements the Europeans make, be it on Project Ukraine or on any other topic, before long they will once again fall into line with the United States. That at least is Putin's prediction, and he's perhaps the most experienced leader in world affairs today, and he's had to deal with the Europeans at extraordinary length over the quarter century that he has been leading Russia, and I've no reason to doubt that he is right. Anyway, there we go. The Europeans all over the place. The Americans, as we will see, gradually edging away from Project Ukraine. And Zelensky himself becoming increasingly difficult to understand and unpredictable, even as he feels the pressure on him grow. Now, a couple of days ago, Zelensky said that he is in fact willing to sit down and negotiate with the Russians. He said nothing, as I discussed in a recent program, about rescinding his decree, preventing negotiations with the Russians. He is ignoring Putin's comments about the fact that Zelensky, has no constitutional basis to negotiate at all, because constitutionally he is not actually the president of Ukraine. He occupies a position in Ukraine which leads to the world continuing to treat him as Ukraine's president, but he has no constitutional right to that position, and therefore his signature on any document is worthless. So Zelensky ignores all of that comes from the Russians. He is now talking about negotiations, something that he has resisted. But even as he talks about negotiations and says that it would be incredibly dangerous for the Americans to negotiate with the Russians without Ukraine being involved, without Ukraine participating in those negotiations. Even as Zelensky says all of this, he continues to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, the importance of these security guarantees, apparently ignoring the fact that President Trump has made it absolutely clear that he has no intention of agreeing to any security guarantees for Ukraine, which would involve the United States. And of course, Zelensky continues to talk about NATO membership, and he continues to talk about the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. The idea first floated by Emmanuel Macron, enthusiastically backed by Keir Starmer, but opposed by everybody else, and an idea that, of course, the Russians absolutely reject. So when Zelensky talks about negotiations and about the fact that he agrees to negotiations, he sets out ideas for those negotiations which will reinforce the Russian belief that he is absolutely not someone that they can negotiate with, because his ideas are completely inconsistent with Russian objectives in Ukraine now. So Zelensky comes up with all of those comments, but he's now coming up with further comments as well. He is, of course, fully conscious of the aid stop that the administration has imposed. He knows all about the fact that Ukraine is not getting the economic and financial and apparently military aid that it used to get from the United States. And he appears to be aware that there is growing talk from the administration about the need for a comprehensive audit on the money the United States has spent on Ukraine. So it seems that Zelensky feels that he has to get his side of the story out first. So he's come out and he's made more statements about this. He says that out of the $176 billion that were allocated to Ukraine, Ukraine has seen less than half that money. Around $100 billion is completely unaccounted for, and Zelensky himself and the Ukrainians have no idea what became of it. An astonishing statement from Zelensky, one, by the way, which he never made previously, at least not in quite those stark terms. He never turned up in Washington and said to the Americans, well, look, you're authorizing all this money. Where is it? We're not seeing any of it. He never said anything like that. But he's saying it now. He says that the Ukrainians only received around 40% of the money that they were allocated. And he is publicly wondering what has become of all of that money. And he is doing that even as he makes further complaints and criticisms of the Biden administration. He says nothing about the Biden administration supporting Ukraine through 3 long years of war, about how President Biden made public statements backing Ukraine for as long as it takes, how the Biden administration used up political capital by going repeatedly to Congress and getting more and more appropriations for Ukraine, how the Biden administration arranged for Ukraine to receive a huge amount of intelligence data, and of course made possible the Ukraine military's communication system through use of Elon Musk's Starlink system, everybody knowing that if that had not been done, given the extent of Russian jamming, the Ukrainian military would not have been able to communicate between its various sections at all. Anyway, Zelensky today has nothing to say about any of that. He comes back, he criticises Biden, he criticises the Biden administration. They didn't do enough. They didn't go anywhere near far enough. They didn't impose enough sanctions on Russia, but before the war began and during the war, they didn't give Ukraine all the weapons it needed. They didn't give Ukraine all the weapons it needed within the time that would have made a difference. He repeats all of that criticism. And he now comes forward and says, well, all of this money that we were given, we may have been given it, but we didn't actually receive it. 60% of it, supposedly, is unaccounted for. Well, for once, I actually believe what Zelensky is saying. I think he's probably right. I think around 60% of the funding allocated to Ukraine never actually reached Ukraine. And in fact, in some cases, it's not difficult to explain that. And nothing straightforwardly illegal perhaps was even done. Because if you did what Brian Beletic regularly does, go through all of the Pentagon's various statements about the aid packages that have been supplied to Ukraine, you would have noticed some time ago that increasingly the Pentagon wasn't providing weapons. They were engaging in contracts for the production of weapons which would be supplied to Ukraine in 6 months' time, or a year's time, or 3 years' time, when the weapons were eventually produced. And a significant amount of the money allocated to Ukraine was in fact being used in that way to buy, or rather to pay for the production of weapons in the United States. And of course, an awful lot went to the US military industrial complex. So that's where at least some of this money has gone, perhaps the greater part of it. But that, of course, isn't the whole story, because, as Zelensky undoubtedly knows, a lot of the money, well, went not to Ukraine, at least not to Ukraine's government, or at least if it did go to Ukraine's government, it wasn't allocated and used properly. It went through all sorts of complex routes to various bank accounts in all kinds of places. It made lots of people very, very rich, but it didn't affect or influence the actual outcome of the war. Now, as it happens, we have that just appeared yesterday a huge article by the American analyst and commentator Gordon Hahn, and he looks into all of this in immense detail. It's one of, if I may say so, one of Gordon Hahn's best pieces. You can find it all set out wonderfully in his Substack blog, Russian and Eurasian Politics, and the title of the article is "The Empty Tank is Demise of the Ukrainian Army Near." And, well, the article is enormous, and it goes into huge detail, and it discusses many, many things. And it says that, yes, part of the problem that the Ukrainian military faces is that there is indeed a recruitment crisis in Ukraine. Mobilization in 2024 was unsuccessful. Ukraine is indeed losing men faster than it can replace them on the battlefronts. But Gordon Hahn also talks at length about the pervasive problem of corruption. And he says that one of the problems that the Ukrainian military is facing is that the announced complement of Ukrainian military units no longer corresponds to the reality. So that, for example, a military unit may claim that it's got 100 men, or at least the officers may be reporting that there are 100 men serving in the unit, but only 40 might actually be there. The other 60, maybe they're in hospital or in the rear someplace, but in many cases they simply don't exist, because we have increasingly a phenomenon right across the Ukrainian army of ghost units, of battalions, where officers are pocketing the salaries of soldiers who simply don't exist. And Gordon Hahn makes the point, drawing on Ukrainian sources, that this explains why in so many places on the front line now you have such a big advantage in the Russians' favour. So you will find, for example, parts of the front line where nominally the Russians have 150 troops for every 100 that the Ukrainians have. But the Russians have all of those troops, or almost all of them. Say there's out of a company of 150 men, there's 140, 145 in the Russian company who are there and willing and able to fight. Well, against them, there's a reduced Ukrainian company of around 100. But out of that figure of 100, there's only actually 40 actually there. So, from a situation where the Russians, in theory, only have a certain superiority, 150 as against 100, which would not be enough, all other things being equal, to provide a decisive advantage to an attacker. You have an actual situation where the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by more than 3 times. And that, of course, absolutely does allow the Russians to conduct the kind of major advances that we see taking place across the battlefields. But it's not just a problem of ghost soldiers or of demoralization and depression amongst the soldiers who are actually there. It's an even bigger problem of corruption that is now affecting every part of the Ukrainian military, with deserters bribing soldiers to enable themselves to be able to retreat, with misappropriation of funds from weapons and uniforms and all that sort of thing. And one gets the sense that as it becomes increasingly clear within Ukraine that the war is lost, this process of corruption, of decomposition, is intensifying and is getting out of control. Now, this is my take, not Gordon Hahn's, but I've heard of this sort of thing before, that as ministers and senior military officers and bureaucrats get the sense that time is limited, that the war is being lost, what they say to each other is, let's get as much money as we can from the donors. Let's get as much money out as we can, because before long it will all be over and we've only got 3 or 6 months left, and we need to get the money together fast, and we need to get it out fast before the curtain finally falls. This was true, by the way, in the last stages of the war in Vietnam. South Vietnam always had corruption issues, but towards the end, corruption became, well, completely out of control. And of course, we've seen something similar happen recently in Syria, as Gordon Hahn talked about. To be clear, the situation in Ukraine is not yet anywhere close to being as bad as it was in Syria. But in Syria, again, this process took a while to evolve. And anyway, it's now rapidly developing in Ukraine itself. And Gordon Hahn suggests that this could lead quite rapidly to a sudden collapse. And he speculates, he wonders what would happen in the event that there were such a collapse. Would the entire regime in Kiev be able to hold together if there was a disintegration of the army? Might political conflict at the center in Kiev spiral out of control? And would regions on the periphery, places like Galicia in western Ukraine, as they sensed that the whole country was starting to collapse and disintegrate, might regions in the West start to make the decision that the time had come for them to bail out and break away, and to see whether they could find new protectors, perhaps in Eastern Europe. Well, who knows? We shall see. But anyway, going back to Zelensky, he cannot be completely unaware of all of this. He must know that there's always been corruption in Ukraine. After all, he's been president of Ukraine for some time now. He must know how pervasive the problem is, and he must also know how damaging for the future viability of Ukraine corruption is. And he must be getting increasingly concerned that if the Americans are really going to carry out the kind of audit of aid for Ukraine that Musk and Trump are talking about, well, all sorts of cans of worms will be opened, destroying any prospect of further funding being authorized. So anyway, there we are. We get this from Zelensky. There's been further signs, by the way, of increasing tension, increasing stress within Ukraine itself. I said in a recent program that after the intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, apparently told a closed meeting that Ukraine has until the summer, about 6 months left before a collapse comes. I said that reports that there was going to be an investigation of who was responsible for that leak might start with Budanov himself. It turns out that that is exactly what is happening, that Zelensky and Yermak and their officials apparently suspect Budanov himself of being the person behind the leak, and that they're investigating him specifically, and that they're looking, presumably, to pin some kind of charge on Budanov, finally to remove him from the scene. Another sign, it seems to me, that the regime in Kiev is starting to crumble. Now, yesterday I spoke about how the Americans, how Kellogg is talking about the need for elections in Ukraine. I said that this was clear code, a clear signal that the Americans want Zelensky to step down. And one can even start to see how this could play out. I just suggest here a scenario. The Russians continue to advance. They're continuing to advance right across the entire line of contact. I don't know of a single part of the line of contact now where the Ukrainians are successfully resisting Russian advances, or where they're mounting successful counterattacks. So the Russians continue their advance. At some point in the next few months, they capture the entirety of the 4 regions, including the city of Zaporozhye, the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, and of course Pokrovsk. They arrive on the Dnieper. Perhaps they cross the Dnieper and reoccupy Kherson city. There was reports in the Times about how Russian drones, FPV drones, are now very, very active over Kherson city itself, and what a toll this is exacting on Ukrainian civilians in that city. So the Russians gain control of the 4 regions. The United States has already by this point said that it accepts that Ukraine cannot join NATO. And at that point, a deal of some kind is done, a quiet deal is done between the Americans and the Russians, whereby the Russians stop. Maybe there's no formal ceasefire, but there's some kind of cessation of hostilities. The Russians are in full control of all of the territory that they say is Russian territory. And then the Americans put the pressure on and get Zelensky to step down and arrange for new elections, perhaps in the atmosphere of a general amnesty. And I noticed that over the last couple of days, the exiled Ukrainian politician Viktor Medvedchuk, who is now in Moscow, has been talking rather more openly again about the future of Ukraine. He's speaking out about how Ukraine in the past has depended on Russia for its security and its stability. He spoke about how the Russians played an instrumental role in protecting Ukraine, for example, from the Turks. And he spoke about how Russians and Ukrainians together in the past have created mighty and strong states, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and perhaps they might do so in the future again. I have to say that, to me, these comments of Medvedchuk almost look like an election platform in conditions of a cessation of violence, of hostilities, with perhaps the Russian military achieving a presence west of the Dnieper. You could almost imagine elections taking place in Ukraine without Zelensky involved, Medvedchuk being elected, and them navigating Ukraine towards some kind of an association with Russia. I'm not saying it's going to happen. This may not be a practical scenario. It could be that there's an awful lot of opposition to Medvedchuk in Ukraine, too much opposition to overcome. But if it does happen, or something like that happens, I have to say that I would not be surprised. And to repeat again what I said in my program yesterday, it does seem to me as if Zelensky's time is now running out. Well, on the subject of all of that American aid that has gone missing, Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's number 2, deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, he's had his own things to say. He's said that when Zelensky says that $100 billion of US assistance never reached Kiev, Medvedev responded on his Telegram channel, this is simply a bald-faced lie. The $100 billion went into the pockets of all kinds of thieves, both in Washington and in Kiev. The money was hoovered up by those at the US Department of Defense, the CIA and defense companies. In fact, due to the large sum of money involved, it took them some time to suck it all up, but they were only too happy to do it. The grift continued in Kiev, with billions of dollars stolen, along with the weapons bought with the money which are now turning up in various parts of the world. What's next? Nothing. The thieves will pardon themselves. Even naive attempts by Elon Musk, however well-intentioned, to investigate systemic theft within US aid and corruption involving assistance to Ukraine will all be for naught. That's what Medvedev has written. It's, of course, deeply cynical. Who can honestly say that Medvedev is going to be wrong, but you can see how, as this plays out, this could all work quite successfully for someone like Medvedchuk, backed by the Russians, in the elections staged in Ukraine with American-Russian agreement. It would be a tidy and neat way, perhaps, to sew up the whole problem, to sort it out, to close down the war without it impacting too disastrously on long-term relations between Washington and Moscow. Well, I don't know that this is going to happen, and let me repeat again, this is not a prediction, what I've just outlined. It's one possible scenario amongst a great many. Further scenarios is that we will see some kind of partition. Georgescu, the man who would have won the election in Romania if it had been held, and who quite plausibly is going to become the president of Romania at some point in the next few months. He is now openly talking about partitioning, certainly Western Ukraine. It may be that something like that is also in the works, but everybody can see that the war in Ukraine is lost, that the Russians have won. Zelensky's former friend and spin doctor, Alexei Arestovich, is saying the same thing. All that remains now, or so it seems to me, is for the Americans and the Russians, and it can only be them, to sort out the details of how the war is going to be ended and how the Russian victory is going to be won. Just saying. Anyway, in the meantime, I can't obviously leave a program like this without saying a little about the military situation in Ukraine. There's been more fighting in Kursk region. It does look as if Sverdlikovo, the village to the north of the main road from Sumy to Suja, the main supply road, it does increasingly look as if the Russians are in the process of storming Sverdlikovo, and that Sverdlikovo will fall completely under Russian control within perhaps the next couple of days. This despite the fact that the Ukrainians are trying to do all that they can to resist there. Apparently there's been lots of film published by the Russians. I haven't seen it, but apparently there's been lots and lots of film which now shows Russian fiber optic drones operating on a continuous basis over this road, the Sumy-Suja road. Ukrainian vehicles and supplies constantly attacked now. There are small country roads that the Ukrainians could in theory use to keep supplied their forces in Kursk region. None of that makes the slightest sense. This is the only big main asphalted road that the Ukrainians can use. It looks as if their communications are now in crisis. It's probably going to have a significant effect on the performance of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region before long. But Zelensky, increasingly bewildered and frightened as he's starting to appear, probably will continue to resist all calls to withdraw from Kursk region before the collapse there actually happens. With every day that passes now, the Russian bridgeheads across the Oskol and Zherebets rivers grow bigger and bigger. The one north of Kupiansk is starting to become very large, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians have transferred enough forces across the Oskol River and secured their communications across the Oskol River to the point where they can launch a major offensive towards Kupiansk and ETHEREUM and ultimately Slavyansk itself. And that must be coming probably in the spring. The Russian bridgeheads across the Zherebets River are also now continuously growing in size, and the Russians appear to be edging ever closer towards Liman, the town east of Slavyansk. It's part of the Slavyansk conurbation, which the Russians briefly held in 2022, and which they are likely to recapture also at some point within the next few months, preparatory to their offensive against Slavyansk also. And, well, there's been more reports of more Russian advances, not just in Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, but in the areas around these two towns. The noose on Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk is starting to tighten, and it also looks as if the Russians are not only expanding their bridgehead, their control over the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, but that they're preparing to capture more villages in this area of this road. There's reports today that they've captured another village called Vodyanie Drucha in this area. And, well, it looks as if the communications that the Ukrainians have to Konstantinovka are becoming increasingly fragile. And, well, there's been less news from Pokrovsk, except that it has been bombed and drone attacked every single day. But in the area of Kurakhovo, south of Kurakhovo, the Russians continue their operations. And with every single day, they seem to be gradually encircling and taking apart the entire Ukrainian force that had been deployed in the Kurakhovo area and which is holding out in the villages southwest of Kurakhovo, and which is the only force that the Ukrainians appear to have left to hold back the Russian advance in this area to the Dnieper. Their reports say that the Russians have by today, already captured the greater part of the village of Dachnie, immediately to the south of Kurakhovo, which is the most eastern of these remaining villages under Ukrainian control. All of this is being done by the Russians now in an almost effortless way. Remember, it's still winter. The ground is sometimes soft, sometimes hard. But the reality is that we probably are going to start to see the big Russian offensives resume in the spring. And, well, both the Russian Defense Ministry and, of course, Budanov are talking about a cascading collapse. Personally, like Budanov, based on everything that I'm seeing play out on the battlefronts, I would not be surprised if the main part of the war is indeed over by midsummer. So there it is. We're in the middle of a major economic revolution in economic affairs. The entire direction of economic policy in the United States since the end of the Second World War has been reversed. The United States reverting back to policies of protection. And to me, it looks for real. The collective West is coming apart as it divides economically within itself. and the Americans showing increasing signs that they've basically given up on Project Ukraine. Their only interest now is in extricating themselves from the debacle, and perhaps beyond that, coming to some sort of arrangement with the Russians about the future securities of Europe. I'm going to make a further prediction, and this is a prediction. At the end of this conflict, Russia will be re-established firmly as a great power, one of the three great powers alongside the United States and China. India might eventually become another full-fledged great power. In fact, I'm convinced that it will, but that's perhaps a decade away. Russia will be the great power in Western Eurasia, adjoining Europe itself. We've seen that the Germans are finding it impossible to give up completely on Russian energy imports. They're increasingly importing more and more LNG. At some point, we're going to see the sanctions gradually fall away, and we're going to be looking at a completely different situation in Europe, one in which the Russians exercise a great deal, not just of economic, but also of political and cultural influence. They will be the big guys on the block, and the Americans will still be there, but not to the same degree. This is going to be a further revolution in political affairs, one we've not seen since the Second World War. It won't be a divided Europe. It will be a Europe in which, as I said, the Russians are established as the great power. And, well, all of us are going to have to become accustomed to that. All of us in Europe are going to have to become accustomed to that, and are going to have to think through precisely what it means. But that's a topic perhaps to discuss for another day in a more detailed way than I can do on a program like this. Let me remind you again in the meantime, because this is where this program ends, that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.